All right, well, hello. I am Doug Kronaizl, a staff writer here at Ballotpedia. In 2021, school board elections became a flashpoint in a way we haven't really seen in some time, driven by a wide range of issues and concerns. As one reporter from the Associated Press put it last year, school board elections that were once uncontested have drawn slates of candidates galvanized by one issue or another. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at those school board elections, the numbers we've crunched, and the conflicts that seem to be driving this increased interest. To help me do all of that today, I have with me staff writer Samuel Wonacott, one of our resident school board gurus. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Doug. Really excited to be here to talk about school board politics.
All right, well, let's dive right in. So why does it seem like school board elections are getting so much attention these days?
It's a great question. We'll talk a little bit more about your work tracking conflicts in school board elections a little later on. But for now, I'll just point out that school board elections have become a microcosm of so many of the debates playing out today in Congress and state legislatures. And I think that's one of the big reasons why people are paying more attention to these local elections.
Great. Well, with that said, let's talk a little bit more about school board elections over the past few years. So what sort of historical information do we at Ballotpedia have on these elections?
Sure. Let me briefly explain Ballotpedia's school board coverage scope. We cover school board elections in nearly 500 school districts, including all school districts in the 100 largest cities by population and the 200 largest school districts by student enrollment. We also cover all school board recall elections, and we'll take a closer look at recall elections a little later in the webinar. So from 2018 to 2021, Ballotpedia covered elections for 3,319 school board seats in 1,141 school districts. On average, over that 4-year period, an average of 829.75 seats were up for election.
So how competitive have those elections been?
Yeah, so between 2018 and 2021, we found that between 24% and 40% of elections were unopposed each year. We also found that incumbents won between 51% and 61% of seats each year, and that between 79% and 89% of incumbents who sought re-election won each year.
All right, so are we seeing more candidates running for school board seats in general?
Between 2018 and 2020, we saw an average of 1.8 candidates per seat up for election. However, in 2021, we had 2.35 candidates per seat up for election. And so far this year, for the 204 school board races we're covering, whose filing deadlines have already passed, an average of 2.19 candidates are running for each seat.
So we're definitely seeing a little bit more activity than we're used to seeing in our coverage scope school boards. So that's interesting trends to be taking a look at, and a great segue to 2022. So what can we expect in terms of our school board coverage this year?
Yeah, so this year we expect to cover school board elections in 28 states and the District of Columbia. Our coverage will include the school board members and candidate profiles, noteworthy election issues, district data, and more. And of course, we'll also publish election results following each election. We're covering the greatest number of school board elections this year in California in 98 states. Texas is next with 74 elections, followed by Arizona, where 42 districts are holding elections.
And do these school board elections, do they work like most other elections with primaries and general elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in some states, school districts hold both primary and general elections. In other states, however, school board candidates face off in general elections only. So for example, Arizona does not hold school board primaries. Instead, all candidates run in general elections scheduled for November 8th. Not all school districts will hold general elections on November 8th, though, and you can find primary and general election dates scattered across the year. In some cases, school districts choose to cancel primary elections or both the primary and general election if the number of candidates who filed did not meet a certain threshold.
Sure, if there's fewer candidates than there are seats or an equal number, there's not really much of an election there. So how do we, have we covered any school board elections so far? You mentioned that being kind of scattered throughout the year. So have we covered any as of March 29th, or are those coming later?
Yeah, no, we've actually covered several elections already this year. On February 8th, for example, we covered school board primary elections in districts across Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, the top two primary candidates go on to participate in an April 5th general election if no candidate wins a majority in the first round of, of balloting. And so those elections are coming up in about a week, those general elections. We've also covered primaries in Wisconsin, which happened on February 15th.
And so you mentioned the Oklahoma general elections coming up. What other elections do we have on the horizon?
Yeah, so April 5th is going to be a big night for school board elections. We'll be covering general school board elections in Alaska, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Wisconsin.
Well, with that and those regularly scheduled elections, let's turn back to something that you mentioned at the start of this conversation, recall elections. Can you briefly explain what a recall election is?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to covering regular school board elections, we also cover recall elections at the school board level. A political recall basically is the process by which citizens can remove elected officials from office before their term is completed. This process typically includes the circulation of petitions by recall organizers, the evaluation of signatures by election officials, and a public vote if the petitions are deemed to have sufficient if organizers are deemed to have collected enough valid signatures.
Sure. And is this something that people can do in every state?
No, in fact, just recall elections in general are not available in all states. But of the 40 states that do allow for the recall of elected officials at the state or local level, only 23 states allow for the recall of school board members. Different states have different rules for initiating a recall election against a school board member. 6 of the states that allow school board recalls, for example, require specific grounds to be met in order for the recall effort to move forward, such as, for example, malfeasance in office. The number of signatures required to get on a school board recall on the ballot also varies by state. In all but one of the states, recall elections are held if enough signatures are collected. However, in Virginia, if enough signatures are collected in that state, a trial is held at the circuit court level.
So instead of an election, it goes into the courts. It's very interesting. And so we've tracked state and local recall efforts for a while here at Ballotpedia, around or over a decade. Could you tell us a little bit about where we stand, or one of the things we talked about a lot has been how 2021 has stood out with respect to years prior?
Yeah, 2021 was a really interesting year for school board recalls. So basically, recall efforts against all types of officials went up last year. We tracked more recall efforts in 2021 than in any other year since we started compiling the data on recalls since in 2012. But most importantly, for all our purposes here, for the first time since we began tracking this data, school board members drew more recall petitions than any other type of office. And in fact, we identified 529 officials targeted for recall in 2021, compared to 301 in 2020 and 233 in 2019. However, we identified 92 school board officials targeted for recall in 2021, compared to 29 in 2020 and 20 in 2019.
I mean, that's a big increase. I mean, looking at that graphic right there, if you hadn't explained all that to me, I would have thought that somebody plugged a number in wrong or something like that. So how is 2020 shaping up for recall efforts against school board officials?
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be another big year for school board recalls. Just so far this year, we've tracked 28 recall efforts against 69 school board officials. Once again, that's the highest number of recalls across all officials. City council members were next with 57 officials named in recalls. 6 school board recalls have gone to a vote this year against 11 officials. And of those 11 officials, 4 were successfully recalled from office.
Well, and I know that one of those that we were covering was probably the most watched recall election so far this year. and it involved three members of the San Francisco Board of Education. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, the San Francisco Unified School District Board of Education recall was probably the most watched recall, school board recall in recent memory. It was against three members of the Unified School District Board of Education. And on February 15th, voters in San Francisco successfully recalled those three officials.
Okay, well, now this recall effort got started last year. Do we know why it took place or what was happening in San Francisco that got us to the recall?
Yeah, so this is going to dovetail nicely when for a topic you're going to talk about soon on about conflicts in school board elections. The notices of intent to recall were filed by two parents of students in the San Francisco school district, and they said that they were frustrated that schools remained closed for nearly a year in reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic. And they also said that they were upset that the board spent time voting to rename buildings in the district rather than focusing on opening schools.
Okay, well, how about the election itself? How did it all pan out?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the three members, they were successfully recalled. They defended their records, but ultimately they were defeated by a margin of more than 44% in every case. And these were the first San Francisco officials to face a recall election since then Mayor Dianne Feinstein in 1983. But so that, like I said, this is going to dovetail nicely with your work on school board conflicts. With the recall in San Francisco, we saw responses to the coronavirus pandemic front and center. So talk a little bit up to us about the different issues we've seen at play and how we've been backing those conflicts.
I mean, most definitely, this has been a really cool project to work on. And we've been doing it since the fall of last year, where we've been looking for some of those hot button issues at play in school districts across the country. So we saw a lot of commentary about some of the more nationwide issues at play in local school board elections and started to ask ourselves, well, how much of this is actually happening? What are the numbers?
Yeah, and it's such a great area for research. There's not a lot out there. So when you mention these nationwide issues, you're talking about things like the coronavirus pandemic, yes?
Yeah, so we actually settled on three issues we wanted to track. Responses to the coronavirus pandemic, that was one of them. So conflicts in elections over things like mask and vaccine requirements and school reopening plans. The other two that we decided to try to take a look at and try to track are race and education, which is oftentimes discussed with the term critical race theory. This includes conflicts over the role of race in curricula and learning materials, as well as district-specific equity or diversity plans. And then the final issue we settled on was sex and gender in schools. And this similarly, it includes conflicts over sexual education curricula and learning materials, as well as the usage of gender-specific facilities like restrooms.
And all three of those are definitely issues we've heard and seen play out in at a larger level, at the federal level or the state legislative level, in races over the past few years. So what's the verdict? Are we seeing these issues pop up more frequently at the school board level too?
Yeah, we are. In total, we have identified 507 school board elections where candidates have taken a stance on one or more of these three issues. And since you can have multiple conflicts in one election, some races had the issues overlap, while others had only one.
So out of those three issues, it looks like the one that has come up the most is race and education with 417. Responses to the coronavirus pandemic next at 372, and sex and gender in schools at 204. And you said this covers 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, and we're still going. So these numbers are kind of changing in real time. And we started tracking this information last fall. So we had a number of districts on our list that held elections in November and some that held elections earlier in 2021. before we started tracking, but now we're focused entirely on the races in 2022.
And the number of those races or the frequency can vary from state to state. So do we have any idea geographically where these issues have been popping up?
Yeah, sure. If you look at this map that we're going to have up here, any of those 36 states where we have identified at least one conflict are colored in. The numbers on top of those states represent the total number of races or elections with conflicts over any of these three issues that we found in that state. But like you mentioned, the number we find is firstly affected by which states are holding elections. Like you said, Wisconsin had primaries in February and general elections coming up. So we've been able to identify quite a few districts there. But the other thing that affects the number we find is our sources. If you look at Pennsylvania, for example, we found quite a few districts because there was a statewide organization there focused on one of the three issues, and it went out and endorsed candidates and races all across the state.
Okay, I see. Because if the endorsing group is in favor of mask requirements in schools and it endorses candidates, then we know that issue is at play in the race. So that actually brings up a good question. How do you go about identifying these races?
Yeah, we identify these races and we identify these conflicts by relying a lot on local reporting. We have some thorough news research happening every day, looking for articles mentioning candidates and these issues, but we'll also utilize things like social media to see if the candidates themselves are bringing any of these issues up on their profile pages, or if they have a platform on their campaign website. And one thing that I'll say to our listeners today while we have you, if you know of a conflict or any of these issues coming up in your local school district election, please send us an email and let us know.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful. And this list includes any and all school board elections, correct? That's not just those in our regular coverage scope.
Yeah, that's a great question. Exactly. We are looking at every school district from the nation's largest to its smallest, and those smaller ones can be tough to find sometimes. So it's always helpful to get input from voters in those areas. Because ultimately, there are over 14,000 school districts nationwide, and we've identified around 500, like we said, with conflict. So that's something like 3.5%. It's definitely a helpful sample, but it's also one that we're really eager to keep growing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely helpful. And once we have the district identified, where does that information go?
Yeah, so we have a page on our website. It's conflicts in school board elections from 2021 to 2022. It has spreadsheets with all of the information that we found, from the district's name to the number of seats up for election to the sources we use to identify the conflict in the first place. We then go and gather information on every candidate in that race too. So we include things like their name, their campaign email, and links to their campaign websites and other profile pages.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. That's some really cool research you're doing, and really just filling a gap, I think, in the research you can find online. And I'm sure we'll continue to grow this project as we move through the 2022 election cycle. So thanks for breaking that down for us.
And definitely. And on that topic of a growing focus and research on school board elections, I hear we have a newsletter devoted to school board politics. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, really happy to do that. Really excited about this particular newsletter. It's our newest weekly newsletter, and we're calling it Hall Pass. And we describe it as a newsletter designed to keep you plugged into the conversations driving school board politics and education policy. So the first edition went out on February 23rd, so not too long ago. And every week we bring you a roundup of the sharpest commentary, debate, and research from across the political spectrum on education, as well as the latest on school board elections and recall efforts. So far, we've featured debate on whether school board elections should be partisan or nonpartisan. We've talked about curriculum transparency bills, Florida's parental rights and education bill, teachers unions, and more. And of course, we've also covered hot topics like the San Francisco Unified School District recall election, which we talked about a few minutes ago. We've talked about why some states have reconsidered their membership in this National School Board Association. And we talked about race and admissions, which is a topic that is before the Supreme Court. And so, as I said earlier, Hall Pass is a weekly newsletter, and the next edition goes out tomorrow. So for audience members who haven't subscribed yet, you still have time to do so before the next edition comes out, and you can get that in your inbox tomorrow.
Well, I mean, that's a great call to action if I've ever heard one. And this has just been a really interesting conversation, and one I'm excited to hear will become a weekly fixture with that newsletter. So thank you so very much for being here.
Yeah, Doug, thanks so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me.
Definitely. And thanks also to Lauren, our communications associate, for the presentation that was part of this briefing. And I understand we touched on a lot of topics today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email editor@ballotpedia.org and we will get you an answer. I also want to remind you that we at Ballotpedia rely on donations for all that we do. So if you like our work and you want to see more of it, please consider donating by going to www.ballotpedia.org/donate to see the ways that you can contribute and make our coverage possible. If you registered for today's briefing, we're going to send you a YouTube link to a recording of the presentation if you'd like to share with friends or watch it again. And then finally, if you want to stay informed about all things school board related, please be sure to subscribe to Hall Pass to get those updates and insights delivered straight to you once a week. We have many other newsletters as well, which you can find a link to on our homepage. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you all have a great day and take care.